Obese girl was traded. For 3 chickens, the mountain man gave his gold mine for her instead. The summer sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty trading post at the edge of the Missouri frontier. It was 1823, and Fort Benton served as the last outpost of civilization before the vast, untamed wilderness stretched westward toward the Rocky Mountains. Inside the dim, smoky interior of McPherson's trading post, a transaction was taking place that would make even the hardest frontiersman's stomach turn. 3 chickens, McPherson, 3 good laying hens, and the girl is yours. Samuel Pritchard's voice carried the desperation of a man who had long since abandoned his dignity. His daughter, Eleanor, stood behind him, her head bowed, her considerable frame trembling beneath a worn calico dress that had seen better days. At 19 years old, she had learned to make herself as small as possible, despite her size, an impossible task that had defined her short, miserable life. Eleanor's father had never forgiven her for being born a girl, for surviving when her mother hadn't, and especially for being what he called an embarrassment to the family name. After his wife's death in childbirth, Samuel had remarried twice, each wife bearing him sons before eventually leaving him. Through it all, Eleanor had remained, cooking, cleaning, and enduring his endless criticisms about her appearance, her appetite, and her very existence. McPherson, a grizzled Scotsman with yellowed teeth and a permanent scowl, circled Eleanor like she was livestock. "She's big enough, I'll grant you that. Could use her in the kitchen, hauling water. Aye, 3 chickens seems fair." Eleanor's eyes burned with unshed tears, but she refused to let them fall. She had cried enough in her 19 years. She wouldn't give these men the satisfaction of seeing her break now. "Done," Samuel said quickly, as if afraid McPherson might change his mind. He thrust out his hand for the shake that would seal his daughter's fate. "Not done." The voice came from the corner of the room, deep and rough as gravel, with an edge that made both men freeze. A figure unfolded itself from the shadows, a mountain of a man who had gone unnoticed until that moment. He stood at least 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out the light from the doorway. His face was weathered and scarred, half hidden beneath a thick black beard, and his eyes were the cold gray of a winter sky. James Bridger, though few knew his Christian name, was known throughout the territory simply as the Mountain Man. He trapped beaver in streams where other men feared to tread, traded with tribes that had killed lesser men for sport, and spent months alone in the wilderness with only his rifle and his thoughts for company. Some said he was half wild himself. Others whispered that he had killed 7 men in a knife fight in St. Louis before fleeing west. No one knew the truth, and no one dared ask. "This ain't your concern, Bridger," Samuel Pritchard said, but his voice wavered. Even desperate men knew better than to challenge the Mountain Man. Bridger took 3 long strides across the room, his moccasined feet silent despite his size. He reached into the leather pouch at his belt and pulled out something that caught the light, a gold nugget the size of a robin's egg, rough and gleaming with promise. "This here's from the claim I worked last winter up in the Bitterroots," Bridger said, his words coming slow and deliberate, as if he wasn't accustomed to using so many at once. "Worth more than 50 laying hens. I'll trade it for the girl." The room fell silent, except for the buzzing of flies and the distant sound of someone shouting in the fort's courtyard. McPherson's eyes nearly popped from his head at the sight of the gold. Samuel Pritchard's mouth worked soundlessly, torn between greed and confusion. "Why?" he finally managed. "Why would you—" "My business," Bridger cut him off. "Take it or leave it." Samuel's hand shot out so fast he nearly dropped the nugget. "Taken. She's yours, whatever you want her for." He didn't even glance at Eleanor as he pocketed the gold and practically ran from the trading post. Eleanor stood frozen, her mind reeling. She had gone from being worth 3 chickens to being worth a fortune in the span of a heartbeat, and she didn't understand any of it. She looked up at the Mountain Man, expecting to see the hunger or cruelty she'd seen in other men's eyes when they thought she wasn't looking. Instead, she saw nothing. His face was as impassive as granite. "Get your things," Bridger said. "I don't have things," Eleanor replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just what I'm wearing." Bridger nodded once, then turned and walked toward the door. Eleanor hesitated, glancing at McPherson, who shrugged and went back to tallying his accounts. She had no choice but to follow. Outside, the afternoon sun was blinding after the dimness of the trading post. Bridger walked to where a massive bay horse stood patiently tied to a hitching post. The animal was as impressive as its owner, with a thick neck and powerful legs built for carrying weight over mountain passes. Bridger swung himself up into the saddle with practiced ease, then extended his hand down to Eleanor. She stared at it, confused. "You can't mean to. I'm too heavy," she said, shame coloring her cheeks. "Horse can carry a full-grown elk. You'll be fine." His tone left no room for argument. Eleanor took his hand, rough and calloused, but surprisingly gentle, and let him pull her up behind him. The horse shifted slightly under the added weight, but made no complaint. Bridger clicked his tongue, and they began moving away from the fort. They rode in silence for hours, leaving the scattered buildings of Fort Benton behind, and entering the endless expanse of prairie grass that rolled like waves toward distant mountains. Eleanor clung to the back of the saddle, trying not to touch the mountain man more than necessary, though the horse's gait made it difficult. She had 1,000 questions, but didn't dare voice any of them. Finally, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Bridger spoke. "Camp here tonight." He dismounted and helped Eleanor down with the same quiet efficiency he'd shown before. Within minutes, he had a fire started and was setting up a simple camp with the ease of long practice. Eleanor stood awkwardly to the side, unsure what to do with herself. "Can cook?" Bridger asked, pulling supplies from his saddlebags. "Yes," Eleanor said quickly. Cooking was one of the few things her father had valued her for. "I can cook very well." Bridger handed her a cast-iron skillet, some dried meat, and a few other provisions, then sat down on a fallen log to clean his rifle. Eleanor got to work, grateful to have something to occupy her hands and mind. She prepared a simple but hearty meal of rehydrated beans, fried salt pork, and pan bread, using techniques she had learned over years of making meals stretch when money was tight. When she handed Bridger his portion, she saw something flicker in his eyes as he took the first bite. Surprise, perhaps, or approval. He ate methodically, saying nothing, but when he'd finished, he nodded. Good. That single word of praise meant more to Eleanor than 100 flowery compliments. She ate her own meal in silence, watching the flames dance and wondering what morning would bring. After they'd eaten, Bridger stood and pointed to his bedroll, already laid out near the fire. "You sleep there. I'll keep watch." "But where will you—" "I'll keep watch," he repeated, and walked to the edge of the firelight, his rifle cradled in his arms. Eleanor wrapped herself in the blankets, which smelled of wood smoke and leather, and stared up at the stars, more stars than she'd ever seen in her life, spread across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. For the first time in years, she felt something strange and unfamiliar. She felt safe. The next morning, Eleanor woke to find Bridger already up, the fire rekindled and coffee boiling. She scrambled to her feet, embarrassed to have slept so late, but he simply handed her a tin cup and gestured for her to sit. "Where are we going?" she finally dared to ask. "North," Bridger said, "into the mountains, my cabin." "And then what?" He looked at her for a long moment, those gray eyes assessing. "Then nothing. You're free. Can stay, can go. Your choice." "I don't understand," Eleanor said, her voice breaking slightly. "Why did you buy me? What do you want from me?" Bridger was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, he said, "Heard your father. Heard what he was doing. It wasn't right." He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. Nobody should be traded like livestock. Nobody. Eleanor felt something crack inside her chest, something that had been frozen and hard for so long she'd forgotten it was there. Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them, years of pain and humiliation finally finding release. Bridger looked uncomfortable, as if her tears were more frightening than any wild animal he'd encountered. He stood abruptly. "I'll pack up. We should move." Over the following days, they fell into a rhythm. They would ride from dawn until dusk, covering vast distances through landscapes that took Eleanor's breath away. Endless prairies giving way to pine forests, crystal streams cutting through valleys, and always the mountains growing larger on the horizon. At night, Eleanor would cook while Bridger tended to the horse and secured their camp. They spoke little, but the silence between them gradually became comfortable rather than awkward. Eleanor learned to read the mountain man's moods through small signs, the set of his shoulders, the way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, the rare times when his expression softened almost imperceptibly. She learned that he moved through the wilderness with a grace that belied his size, and that he possessed an almost supernatural awareness of everything around them. On their 5th day of travel, they came across a creek swollen with snowmelt. Bridger studied it for a moment, then dismounted. "Too deep," he said. "We'll cross upstream where it's shallower." But as he led the horse along the bank, searching for a crossing point, Eleanor spotted something that made her gasp: a young deer, barely more than a fawn, trapped on a small island in the middle of the rushing water, bleeding pitifully. "It's stuck," Eleanor said, pointing. "The poor thing." Bridger followed her gaze and grunted. Nature's way. "But it's just a baby," Eleanor protested. Can't save everything," Bridger said, but he was already removing his boots and coat. Eleanor watched in amazement as the mountain man waded into the icy water, moving carefully against the current. The water reached his waist, but he kept his footing, his powerful legs anchored against the rushing flow. When he reached the fawn, it tried to bolt, but Bridger caught it gently, holding it against his chest as he made his way back to shore. He set the trembling animal down on the bank, where it shook itself and bounded away into the forest without a backward glance. Bridger stood dripping, his expression unreadable. "That was kind," Eleanor said softly. "Foolish," Bridger corrected, but there was no heat in his words. That night, as Eleanor prepared their meal, she found herself humming, something she hadn't done since childhood. Bridger glanced up from where he was mending a piece of leather tack, and if she wasn't mistaken, the corner of his mouth twitched upward, just slightly. "You sing?" he asked. "Used to," Eleanor said, surprised he'd initiated conversation. "My mother taught me hymns before she passed. My father said I sounded like a dying cow, so I stopped." Bridger frowned. "Your father was a fool." The simple declaration, delivered in his matter-of-fact tone, made Eleanor laugh, a real laugh, bright and unexpected. Bridger's eyes widened slightly, as if the sound had startled him, but then that almost smile appeared again. "Would like to hear. Sometime," he said gruffly, then returned to his work, clearly uncomfortable with having revealed even that much. They reached Bridger's cabin on the 10th day of their journey. It was nestled in a valley surrounded by towering pines, with a clear stream running nearby and mountains rising majestically in the distance. The cabin itself was solidly built from hewn logs with a stone chimney and real glass windows, luxuries in this untamed land. "Built it myself," Bridger said, the most words he'd volunteered about himself, 5 winters back. Inside, the cabin was sparse but functional, with a large fireplace, a sturdy table and chairs, shelves lined with supplies, and a sleeping loft accessed by a ladder. Everything was neat and organized, the home of a man who relied on knowing exactly where his possessions were. "Loft is yours," Bridger said. "I'll sleep down here." "I can't take your bed," Eleanor protested. "Not mine. Built it for—" He stopped abruptly, his jaw tightening. "It's yours." Eleanor sensed there was a story there, but she didn't push. Instead, she explored her new home, running her fingers over the smooth wood of the table, admiring the craftsmanship. That evening, she made the best meal she could with the supplies available, determined to show her gratitude in the only way she knew how. As they ate, she made a decision. "I'd like to stay," she said. "If that's all right. I can cook and clean, tend the garden if you have one, help with whatever needs doing, to repay you for the gold." Bridger set down his fork and fixed her with those penetrating gray eyes. "Told you, you're free. Don't owe me anything." "I know," Eleanor said, "but I want to. I have nowhere else to go, and She took a breath. "I like it here. I like the quiet. I like not being afraid all the time." Something shifted in Bridger's expression, a softening around his eyes. He nodded slowly. "Stay as long as you want, then. Winter's coming, mountains get snowed in, might be stuck here till spring thaw." "That's fine," Eleanor said, and meant it. As the weeks passed, Eleanor settled into life in the mountains with an ease that surprised her. She took over all the cooking and cleaning, tended the small vegetable garden behind the cabin that had been neglected, and learned to preserve food for the coming winter. Bridger, for his part, hunted, trapped, chopped wood, and made repairs to the cabin and outbuildings. They worked separately but in harmony, like two musicians playing different instruments, but creating the same song. Gradually, Bridger began to talk more, not long conversations, but small observations about the weather, the animals, the land. Eleanor learned that he'd come west after the War of 1812, that he'd been trapping for nearly a decade, and that he valued solitude above almost anything else. "Then why did you save me?" Eleanor asked one evening as they sat by the fire, her mending in her lap, his hands busy carving a new handle for his knife. Bridger was quiet for so long, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Had a sister once. Mary. She was round like you, soft-spoken. Our father was a hard man, used his fists more than his words. One day he beat her so bad. His hands stilled on the carving. She died 3 days later. I was 14, too young, too weak to stop him. After she was buried, I waited until he was asleep and left. Never went back." Eleanor's heart ached for the boy he'd been, for the sister he'd lost. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "When I heard your father, saw him trading you like you were nothing." Bridger's jaw clenched. "Couldn't let it happen. Wouldn't." "You saved me," Eleanor said simply. "You gave up gold to save someone you didn't even know." "Gold can be found again," Bridger said, meeting her eyes. "A life can't." That night, lying in the loft, Eleanor realized she was falling in love with the mountain man, this scarred, silent giant who had shown her more kindness than anyone else in her life. The realization terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. The first snow came in late October, dusting the peaks white and painting the valley in shades of silver. Eleanor stood at the cabin door, watching the flakes fall, and felt Bridger come to stand beside her, closer than he usually did, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his large frame. "Beautiful," she breathed. "Yes," Bridger agreed, but when Eleanor glanced at him, he wasn't looking at the snow. He was looking at her. Winter descended in earnest, and as the snow piled higher, sealing them in their mountain sanctuary, something shifted between them. Bridger began teaching Eleanor the skills she'd need to survive in the wilderness, how to read tracks in the snow, how to tell edible plants from poisonous ones, how to handle his rifle, though it was almost too heavy for her to lift. She, in turn, taught him things he'd forgotten or never learned, how to appreciate a well-told story, how to find joy in small moments, how to laugh. They spent long evenings by the fire, Eleanor reading aloud from Bridger's small collection of books while he worked on various projects. Sometimes she would sing, her voice filling the cabin with hymns and folk songs, and Bridger would stop whatever he was doing to listen, his expression peaceful. One bitter cold night in January, Eleanor woke to sounds from below, Bridger crying out in his sleep, trapped in some nightmare. Without thinking, she climbed down the ladder and approached where he lay on his bedroll near the banked fire. He was thrashing, his face contorted. "James," she said softly, using his Christian name for the first time. James, wake up." His eyes flew open, and for a moment he looked lost, disoriented. Then he focused on her and sat up, breathing hard. "Sorry," he muttered. "Didn't mean to wake you." "Was it about Mary?" Eleanor asked gently. He nodded, running a hand through his hair. "And others. Men I've killed. Things I've done." Eleanor sat down beside him carefully, giving him space to move away if he wanted. He didn't. Instead, slowly, hesitantly, he reached out and took her hand in his much larger one. "You make it quiet," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "In my head, all the noise, the memories. When you're here, it gets quiet." "You make me feel safe," Eleanor replied. "For the first time in my life, I feel like I matter. Like I'm not just taking up space that someone else deserves more." "You matter," Bridger said fiercely. "Don't ever think you don't." They sat in silence, hands clasped, watching the embers glow. Neither of them moved to break the contact, and eventually, Eleanor felt Bridger's thumb begin to trace small circles on the back of her hand, a tender gesture that made her heart race. "Eleanor," he said finally, "I'm not good with words, never have been, but He took a deep breath. "I need you to know that you're not here because you owe me anything. You're here because I want you here. Because He struggled with the words. "Because I care for you, more than I've cared for anyone since Mary." Eleanor turned to face him fully, her free hand coming up to cup his bearded cheek. "I love you," she said simply. "I think I've loved you since you saved that fawn, maybe even before. You're the best man I've ever known, James Bridger." Bridger's eyes widened, then filled with an emotion so intense it took Eleanor's breath away. He leaned forward slowly, giving her every chance to pull back, and brushed his lips against hers, a kiss as gentle as it was profound. When they finally parted, Bridger rested his forehead against hers. "Love you too," he whispered. "Didn't think I could. Didn't think anyone would want—" "I want," Eleanor assured him. "I want you exactly as you are." From that night forward, they were truly partners. As winter gradually loosened its grip and spring began to appear in tentative green shoots through the melting snow, they made plans for their future. Bridger taught Eleanor to trap and hunt, to read the weather and the land. Eleanor continued to transform the cabin into a true home, adding touches of comfort and beauty to the functional space. On a sunny day in early May, with wildflowers blooming across the valley and birdsong filling the air, Bridger took Eleanor's hand and led her to a spot overlooking the stream. "Had a preacher with a wagon train pass through last week while you were at the garden," he said. "Asked him to come back. He'll be here tomorrow." He looked at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, the mountain man looked nervous. "If you'll have me." "No, I'm not much. Too quiet, too rough, got too much blood on my hands." Eleanor silenced him with a kiss. "Yes," she said when they parted. 1,000 times yes. The wedding was simple. Just the preacher, Eleanor, and Bridger, with the mountains as their cathedral and the sky as their roof. Eleanor wore a new dress that Bridger had commissioned from a seamstress at Fort Benton, the finest thing she'd ever owned. Bridger wore his cleanest buckskins and had even trimmed his beard, though Eleanor had made him promise not to shave it off entirely. She'd grown fond of it. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Bridger kissed his bride with a tenderness that belied his fierce reputation, and Eleanor knew she had finally found where she belonged. The first year of their marriage was a time of adjustment and joy. Eleanor had worried that Bridger might grow tired of her presence, that he would long for his old solitary life, but instead, he seemed to bloom in her company. He smiled more, laughed occasionally, and though he would never be talkative, he shared more of himself with each passing day. That summer, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. When she told Bridger, he stared at her for a long moment, his face unreadable, and she felt a flutter of fear. Then he scooped her up in his arms, careful despite his excitement, and spun her around, a broad grin splitting his bearded face. "A baby," he said, wonder in his voice. our baby." Over the following months, Bridger became almost comically protective. He insisted Eleanor rest more, do less heavy work, avoid anything that might possibly be dangerous. Eleanor tolerated his hovering with amused patience, knowing it came from love and his own painful losses. Their daughter was born on a February morning with snow falling softly outside, delivered with the help of a Shoshone woman named Willow, who lived in the mountains nearby and had become Eleanor's friend. They named her Mary, after Bridger's lost sister, and when he held his daughter for the first time, tears streamed down the mountain man's weathered face. "I'll protect you," he whispered to the tiny bundle in his arms, "both of you, always." And he did. Little Mary grew up wild and free in the mountains, learning to track with her father and cook with her mother, equally comfortable in buckskins or dresses, speaking English and Shoshone with equal fluency. 2 years later, a son arrived, Samuel, called Sam, who had his father's gray eyes and his mother's gentle nature. As the children grew, the cabin expanded. Bridger built additional rooms, a proper barn for the horses and livestock they had acquired, a smokehouse, and a root cellar. The isolated mountain cabin became a homestead, and eventually other families began settling in the valley, drawn by reports of good trapping and rich soil. Bridger never became a social man, but he earned a reputation as fair and honest, someone who could be trusted to keep his word and help a neighbor in need. Eleanor became the heart of the small community, organizing gatherings, teaching children to read, and tending to the sick with remedies she learned from Willow. On their 10th anniversary, Bridger gave Eleanor a beautiful necklace he'd commissioned, a gold pendant shaped like the mountains with a small sapphire for the sky. "10 years ago, I gave away my gold for you," he said as he fastened it around her neck. "Best trade I ever made. You gave me everything I never knew I needed. A home, a family, a reason to be more than just a man surviving in the wilderness." Eleanor turned in his arms, looking up at her husband. He was grayer now, his beard shot through with silver, new lines around his eyes. But those eyes still held that same fierce protectiveness and deep love. "You saved me," she said. "You saw worth in me when no one else did, not even myself. You gave me freedom, and I chose to stay. I'd make that choice every day for the rest of my life." "Good," Bridger said, pulling her close, "because I'm not letting you go." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching Mary and Sam play by the stream, Eleanor thought back to that day in the trading post when her father had tried to trade her for 3 chickens. She thought about the mountain man who had stepped from the shadows and changed everything, who had given up his gold for a girl everyone said was worthless. She thought about how wrong they all had been, her father, McPherson, everyone who had ever made her feel less than. She wasn't worthless. She was loved, cherished, valued beyond measure. She had built a life of purpose and joy in these mountains, had raised children who would never doubt their worth, had loved and been loved in return by the best man she'd ever known. The gold Bridger had traded for her had been found and spent long ago, but what he'd gained in return, what they'd gained together, was priceless and eternal. Their love had transformed them both, healing old wounds and creating something beautiful from pain and loneliness. As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Eleanor reached for Bridger's hand. He took it, as he always did, and they sat in comfortable silence, 2 souls who had found each other in the unlikeliest of circumstances and built a life that was worth more than all the gold in the mountains. Mary ran up to the porch, her dark braids flying. "Papa, Mama, come see! Sam caught a fish!" Bridger stood, his lips quirking in that almost smile that Eleanor loved. "Better go see this fish before it becomes a story about the one that got away." Eleanor laughed and followed her husband and daughter toward the stream, where their son proudly displayed a small trout. This was her life, simple, hard sometimes, but filled with love and laughter and purpose. She had been traded for nothing and bought with gold, but what she'd gained was beyond any price. She was free, she was loved, and she was home.